Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our fourth webinar of the series titled Combating Corruption, Approaching Regulatory Affairs and Government. This webinar is being held as part of our Anti-Corruption Best Practices program and is part of a series of webinars held in collaboration with the GoodCorporation. To give you a brief introduction to those of you that aren't familiar with the Pearl Initiative, the Pearl Initiative is the region's leading independent non-profit founded to promote a corporate culture of accountability and transparency as a key driver of business competitiveness across the Gulf region's private sector. This webinar is being held instead of in-person events due to the public health pandemic, and all of our events are on our YouTube channel to watch on demand later. So if you do miss any of our events, please do use our webinar channel for on-demand viewing. About today's webinar, data gathered by anti-corruption experts in the area of government and regulatory affairs continues to raise concerns, with the OECD and the UK Bribery Act both focusing on the specific issue of companies bribing public officials abroad. Interactions between businesses and their host governments around the world have never been more closely scrutinised. Basic controls such as written registers of government intermediaries became less adequate in the period between 2014 and last year. Almost half of the companies assessed failed to provide sufficient training on how to handle requests for facilitation payments from public officials. Today's webinar will examine data taken from over 100 on-site anti-bribery and corruption assessments over the past 10 years, in which more than 7,000 business practices have been put to the test. Leveraging the expertise and knowledge from our guest speakers here with us today, we aim to discuss ways to overcome the complexities and establish meaningful controls in this area. We will also identify those areas of government interaction where companies most often fail and the examples of best practice which can help companies to remain compliant in this famously high-risk area. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Joining us from the UAE is Amin Antari. Amin is the Managing Director of Kroll's Business Intelligence and Investigations Practice and Head of Middle East. Amin has 15 years of experience working with multinational companies, financial institutions and consulting firms in the Middle East, North Africa and North America. He has particular expertise in investigations with a strong knowledge of international regulatory requirements as well as obligations with monitorship and debarments. Over his career, Amin has assisted diverse financial institutions, governmental agencies, development organisations and engineering companies with their fraud and corruption investigations, fraud and corruption risk assessments and anti-money laundering initiatives. Prior to joining Kroll, Amin was appointed as the Head of Compliance Investigations at SNC-Lavalin to establish the investigation department in its Montreal office, but spent his last 2 years with a firm in Abu Dhabi, with primary responsibility for investigating and mitigating risks related to bribery, corruption and fraud. Thank you, Amin, for joining us today and imparting your expertise and knowledge from your exposure on the ground.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us once again from London is Michael Pollitt, Senior Business Ethics Consultant at GoodCorporation. A regular speaker and trainer on business ethics and issues of ethical company culture, Michael has conducted business ethics training sessions and webinars across the MENA region, including most recently a day-long workshop on business ethics and compliance with clients and potential clients of a European bank in Cairo. His experience in the MENA region also includes work in Algeria and Saudi Arabia. Before joining GoodCorporation, Michael worked as a lead researcher and advisor on business ethics to the chair of the Modern Slavery Bill Evidence Review at the UK Parliament. While in Parliament, Michael worked with a number of high-profile UK politicians, government ministers and government suppliers, focusing on business ethics in general and human rights in particular. Thank you, Michael, once again for joining us.
Absolutely.
Before I hand over to Michael, because with all of our webinars, we do like them to be as interactive as possible. So please do use the panel on the right to submit your questions and they'll be fielded through to Michael and Amin accordingly, and make the most of their expertise here for today. So hope you enjoyed today's session. I'll hand over now to Michael. He'll go through a 10-minute presentation highlighting the work of the GoodCorporation and their survey findings in this realm, and then he'll initiate a deep dive with Amin. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yasmin. So it's great to be back and doing another session in this area. As Yasmin says, we like questions. We especially like controversial questions, but our subject today is going to be quite uncontroversial. We're going to be talking about how companies can mitigate any risks that they have when they're interacting with public officials on the ground, wherever that might be, whether it's South America, Africa, or the Eastern Europe. It's a topic which a lot of people ask us about as business ethics experts, and it's a topic which we think a lot of companies could be doing better at. But just to begin by talking about why GoodCorporation is qualified to speak in this area. We've been working in the area of business ethics and compliance for about 20 years now, and in that time we've done well over 600 assessments and projects related to business ethics in general in 85 countries. So we hope that we're bringing to this some international experience. This is not just about the Gulf or the MENA region, this is about problems in the world in general. Since the UK Bribery Act came out, we've been doing a lot more work in the area of anti-bribery and corruption specifically. So we developed some materials that allow us to assess companies against good practice in the area of anti-bribery and corruption. And we've done now, as Yasmin says, well over 100 assessments on the ground with companies over the last 10 years or so. So we're going to be leveraging some of that experience today, looking at some of the data that we get from all that assessment work and what it tells us about what companies are doing well and badly, and what it can tell you guys as participants about key ways that you can improve in this area. But first of all, I'm going to start by a bit of an introduction to what we're talking about today. Some people here will be very experienced in the area of ethics and compliance. Some people will be less experienced. So I think it's good to start with an overview of some key definitions here. So when we talk about public officials in our work, we're generally looking at the UK Bribery Act guidance on this. There are other definitions which we're going to go into later, but basically we're looking at people who hold legislative or judicial control, people who are performing some kind of public function within a national or local government, people who are working for government-owned enterprises, things like public health agencies or state-owned enterprises, and any government, any official or agent working for a public international organization like the UN or the World Bank. And crucially, we're not just talking about elected officials here. Sometimes people think when we talk about public officials, we're just talking about politicians. We're not just talking about the people you would vote for in an election, we're talking about the whole machinery of government and the risks that go with that in our session today. So just taking a step back then and looking at the way government interactions are viewed in the eyes of the major instruments in anti-bribery and corruption law, we're looking at the FCPA in the US, we're looking at the UK Bribery Act in the UK, we're looking at the Loi Sapin 2 in France, and all of these laws place quite a lot of importance on controls in the area of government interactions. So in the UK Bribery Act, we have a standalone offence for anybody who bribes a foreign public official. Under the FCPA, we have an offence of unlawful payment to foreign officials for the purposes of influencing their decisions, influencing their actions and decisions. Interestingly, when we look at the FCPA example, and we can perhaps talk about this in more detail later, there is an exception for facilitating or expediting payments. So if you are paying somebody in a public function to do their job more quickly, that's an area that's slightly more grey when it comes to the US context. But it's not a grey area in the latest French legislation. The French have been true to form, being very direct, as they're known for being in this issue, and there is no exception for facilitation payments to public officials or any kind of gift and hospitality when it comes to the French example, which came out just 2 or 3 years ago. And so any actions in that area could very easily be construed as bribery. We really need to be watching out for these things. In terms of what we look for as key expectations, I'm going to talk a little bit about the key areas of good practice we look for in our assessments, because the laws are different in this area in terms of actual legislation. So we look for, first of all, it's a no-brainer, some clear policies and procedures in this area. When we're looking at policies and procedures, we're not just looking for the fact that they exist, we're also looking for specific things. So if those procedures and policies prevent political contributions, i.e. large-scale donations to political parties, we would see that as good practice. Preventing any kind of undue influence or preferential treatment of certain politicians or public officials, and preventing, of course, any kind of inducement, any kind of gift in cash or in any other form to make them do something. We're looking at that quite closely in our assessments. We're also looking not just for documents, pieces of paper, we're looking for communication, like I'm communicating these policies now, and not just in the form of, we sent an email to our intermediaries, also training. So if you can back up your policies, using training of key high-risk individuals, then you are far more likely to succeed in this area. The third bullet point on here, we talk a lot about in our assessment work, community projects and charitable contributions, because it's a very easy way to get this wrong. If you find as a company that you want to contribute a lot of money to a local charity, and then you realize the next day that that charity is run by the local politician who's running for election, then it just looks very bad. And so we need controls in the area of charity as well. And then finally, constructive dialogue with government and authorities. So governments know that this is a risk, and they know how government interactions are perceived in business. So getting some kind of a dialogue going with people in these governments and public offices is often a very good practice that we look for. Just to round up the key expectations then, a register is something that Yasmin mentioned in the introduction. We would often look for companies to be using a register of anybody interacting with public officials on their behalf. And interestingly, we can talk later about the fact that for some reason this is very difficult. But we would expect companies to be able to list for us all the agents that they use in customs clearance or visas or getting licenses, etc. Anybody they have within their immediate sphere who's exposed to public officials. We would also expect any intermediaries that are being used to have clear terms and conditions in their contracts and a clear understanding of what the company's policy is in this area. Gifts and hospitality are obviously a key area. We would expect little to no gifts and hospitality with public officials, and linked to that, the idea of justifiable remuneration for permitting agents. Permitting agents is a term that GoodCorporation uses quite a lot, but not many people do. It just means anybody employed on your behalf to get licenses, for example, to get permits that you need to do your business. And if you are paying those guys a lot of money, then you are putting yourself at risk that they will be passing some of that money on to decision makers in government. And finally, some kind of a policy to say that anybody politically connected within the organization will not be using that for undue advantage. So we take all those areas of good practice that we know and we put it into an assessment framework, which looks a bit like this. And once we've done that, we can grade companies using the grading system you can see on the screen now. We look for what policies and systems and processes they have in place, and then we can give them grades, top 2 grades being adequate procedures, bottom 2 grades being inadequate procedures. And from that, we're able to compare lots of companies with lots of other companies. And this chart shows you some of the best companies we've ever seen, companies who have completely green, so completely adequate procedures, and some of the worst, so some of the companies who have lots of reds, meaning lots of inadequate procedures. But we're not just going to leave it there. We're going to dive down a little more deeply now into some of the statistics that assessment work has given us. And this shows you some of the key areas of good practice that we talked about and how companies are performing. These charts show inadequate procedures. So high numbers in these charts are bad. The dark colors are the 2014 data. The lighter colors are the 2019 data. And so as you can see, there's been quite a lot of significant improvements here between 2014 and 2019. The level of inadequate procedures reduced quite a lot, for example, in the area of third parties following the company's gifts and hospitality policies. What we also notice is that there's been a big increase in terms of the procedures that companies have in place to control facilitation payments. So if we look at the second row, facilitation payments, procedures and training, companies got a lot better at that over the past 5 years. And I think this is partly because there are new laws on this, such as the French example that I talked about, but partly because people are just having a lot more conversations like we're having now. They're agreeing that this is a big issue. We're also seeing lots of companies getting things wrong. Okay, so it's not a totally rosy picture. We can see there that the rate of inadequate procedures in terms of registering your third parties dealing with public officials, that's actually gone up. And we think that might be perhaps because the world is becoming a lot more of a globalized place. And so we have more and more companies dealing with more and more governments in different areas. And so it's harder to keep track of who's interacting with them on our behalf. An interesting finding also is the idea that we're getting better at training. So we're getting better at managing our relations with public officials through things like training and communication. And we think this is partly because there are so many examples now of companies getting this wrong, because so many companies previously were not communicating properly with their third parties, and they were using things like lobbyists, intermediaries, or political consultants who were engaging in corrupt activity on their behalf. There was a story back in 2014 of a manufacturing company that I won't name, who was bidding for a big public power project in Egypt. And I think they paid something like 5 million euros to their political consultants to liaise with the Egyptian government authorities on their behalf. And they ended up as agents taking these Egyptian public officials out for lavish travel, lavish entertainment, shopping, sightseeing, dinner tickets. I think they got them tickets to a Broadway musical in New York. Eventually, this company won the contract it was bidding for in the Egyptian public sector, but they also ended up paying about 770 million US dollars in fines after this activity came to light. So the last bit of statistics before I wrap up then, these statistics look at more general things. So little things like payments to public officials and facilitation payments. These are very basic things that we would expect companies to be avoiding. And as you can see, the statistics were quite low in 2014 and they've gotten even better. So I think we are seeing improvements in this area, but it's only because people are having conversations like this and talking more about the risks. And I think it's important to say that when we think about these things, when we think about payments to government officials, it doesn't mean that we're saying every single person working for the government in a certain country or a certain environment is a corrupt person. It doesn't mean that at all. This might also be because we are thinking and working in countries where the economic situation is very fragile, and so there just isn't enough money around to pay public sector employees properly, and so you end up with lots and lots of public officials who are relying on the fact that they can use their decision-making power to make more money. Okay, and we're not saying it's right, but we're saying it's perhaps understandable. And so they get used to asking for additional bits of money where they can. And that's perhaps why in many countries, the word for tip, the word for tips, like you would give to a waiter, is the same as the word that you would use for bribery. It's like giving a tip to a public official. It doesn't make it okay, but I do need to put these things in context because they are sometimes understandable. So just to wrap up then, some of the worst things that we see are no clear policy, like we talked about, no clear training, and excessive fees paid to political consultants, like in the example I gave from Egypt. And some of the best things we see are clear public policies on this that are communicated to permitting agents and intermediaries, having robust recording systems for who interacts with public officials on our behalf, and the meetings that they attend with public officials, making sure that it's clear from those records we don't have individuals visiting public officials on their own, because it's always better to go as a pair so you can compare and you have another viewpoint on what happened. And finally, that basic issue of registers. This is getting worse. We don't understand why companies are getting worse at registering their agents. Perhaps it's because there are too many political consultants being used now, but it's a really good area of practice to adopt, that you would record who's doing this on your behalf and what they're doing. So those are the key considerations and takeaways then. I'm gonna shut up now, but it's about recognizing that increasing pressure from regulators that we talked about, making sure you have the policy in place, the training in place, the records in place, and avoiding any kind of excessive fees paid to political consultants, because you don't want to end up like the company in the example that I gave there. So I'm going to turn the attention now onto our guest speaker, which is Amin Antari, and I think this is going to be the part of the show, as it were, that's going to be most beneficial for you, because he's bringing a lot of important insights into this area. And I'm going to start off, by saying I basically gave an overview there of my experience, which is, based, at least in terms of where we're headquartered in the European context. But I understand that when it comes to definitions, etc., there are new developments being made in the UAE legislation. Can you tell me more about the local laws and how these are changing?
Sure. So there were recent changes. So you were referring earlier to the definition of public officials, and back in I would say 2016, there were a few changes to the penal code that refers to anti-bribery laws included in it, and among those changes, the expanding of the anti-bribery legislation to the private sector, including even if, let's say, UAE national as well as a UAE employee is out of the UAE, would be that law, the anti-bribery law, would be applicable. But specifically to the definition, they've added, in addition to the government employees and all the definitions that are applicable in the UK Bribery Act or the FCPA, they've added, which wasn't the case before, they've added members of international organizations, which wasn't prior to 2016. But I think, and that's the UAE, but there are a lot of changes happening across the region, Saudi as well, where there's a clear interest and will to update the laws and also make them as close as international best practices, whether it's the UK Bribery Act of the FCPA.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because when we think about the developments in legislation, of course, it's governments that do this, right? It's ruling authorities and it's parliaments and it's public officials who are making these changes. So yep. Perhaps it comes back to the point I was sort of touching on earlier, that governments themselves know about the risk in this area. Is that your experience too?
Yeah, of course they know about it, but again, like I said, there for the past, I would say, 5 years, there've been it's becoming a lot more important, and there is a significant focus on and that's due to either increased enforcement, either regionally or by international, such as the DOJ or SEC. As well as a change in generations. So you have a lot of a new generation of employees are coming in that have studied abroad, for instance, and are taking over a certain leadership role and want to change things around. But also from a economical standpoint, a lot of company want to operate and work with international companies, and therefore, in order for them to get foreign investment, they need to make sure that they are complying with best practices, and whether it's to get visas or internal controls that would make those foreign investors or foreign companies comfortable in their headquarters.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, one of your jobs, if you're a politician, is to attract investment into the country, not just like foreign direct investment, but also things like you want companies to come and set up business there. You want to be a place where it's safe to do business. And if you're a place that's known for being slightly, difficult in terms of the payments that are required of you by public officials when you work there, then yeah, you're not going to attract that kind of investment or that kind of business. So it's massively in the interest of governments themselves to get this right.
Yeah, and that's why you see, for instance, in the UAE or elsewhere in the region, at least, there is a push for digitalization of a lot of governmental activities, and so that basically limiting the physical interaction with government officials. So payments are done online. Submitting the basically the official documentation and so on is done online. So it really limits, or at least reduces the interaction, the physical interactions, where sometime before maybe you were going to an office and you were waiting, and basically the government official was trying to get a payment from you. And that, I think, at least one of the positive implication of maybe the pandemic is it pushed for a lot of digitalization and a lot of things that are happening online. Maybe here, maybe in the UAE, it's well advanced compared to other places in the world, but in other places, the government needed to become more digitalized and become more online, and that helped a lot. I would say at least that's one, if not the only one, good thing about the pandemic that I'm seeing from with respect to interaction with government officials.
Yeah, I mean, you can't bribe a computer, can you? You
No,
can try.
definitely, yeah.
Okay, so that's, I mean, we can certainly come back to the COVID question and the kind of digitalization question, but I'm going to keep going with some of these questions about your experience and what kind of expertise you can bring to this, because I was struck when I was reading about your background that you've been working in this area for a long time, and you've been working in some interesting parts of the world. And I guess a very general question that might allow you to share some of your experiences. When we talk about the issues of government relations and regulatory affairs, like in the initial presentation, how are these things being viewed by the companies you work with in the private sector, leaving aside governments for a minute? And have you seen any trends in this area over the years?
Well, yeah, I think companies are taking it more seriously, a lot more seriously than before, especially companies that have been hit or seeing their peers within the same industry being hit. And a lot of it, I would say, it's due to interaction with public officials, whether it's in the context of, getting a permit or license to operate, whether it's to getting visas, so more on the administrative and logistical side, but also getting contracts. To your example earlier with one of the company in Egypt. So that's really something that a lot of the companies are looking at, and a lot of that, again, from the recent event of some of the companies I'm working with, there is usually an intermediary involved. Whether we call it agent, BD consultant, whatever the term, it's something that is very third-party risk is quite high here in the region, especially when a company doesn't have any subsidiary or is not used to operating in this region or in certain countries. So definitely, before, I would say, international company were used to the phrase, well, that's how we do business in that country. And we've heard it so many times, and I don't hear it that much anymore, to be honest with you. So, which is a good thing. So that phrase is not acceptable anymore because, like I said, people learn from their mistakes and or the mistakes of others, and which is quite positive. So we're seeing definitely a bigger focus and companies wanting to get it right and not to be in that situation and not to affect their reputations in the future.
Yeah, it's also kind of insulting, isn't it? These companies that say, "Oh, we know how to do things when we go and do work in, I don't know, India or Venezuela or etc." It perpetuates a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that every time you go and do business there, you're going to have to do things the same way. And the more that companies get used to that's how business is done here, that kind of mentality, the more that they're creating a vicious cycle within that country itself, where public officials feel like they can ask for these kinds of payments. And because of that, the country never quite gets the economic stability that it needs.
Well, you're right. I think the vicious cycle is also aggravated by the fact that a lot of the countries don't have stringent anti-bribery laws, such as the US or let's say North America, the UK, and other jurisdictions. And therefore, speaking to some of the clients, they're telling me, well, I'm trying to bid on a project, but there is a company from this country, without naming the country, is bribing an official, and their authorities don't necessarily care, and it's unfair to them. So it definitely creates that frustration to international companies, but I feel that it's the right thing to do, and basically it's not because others are doing the wrong thing that you need to do the same, and therefore they kind of have that frustrated feeling, but that's again another thing, aggravating factor that companies are going through, especially companies that need to abide by international best practices.
Yeah, and I think one of the points I've made in previous webinars is that when it comes to that question of the way business is done there or the way business is done here, I think we're seeing an increasing trend of companies who are setting their own standards of what's acceptable, and not allowing any of their intermediaries or agents or subsidiaries or operating businesses in any of these other environments to do things differently. If you are a large multinational and you're doing business in everywhere from Sweden to Congo, you can set yourself some very high standards and make sure that despite the difficulties, you're at least asking people to meet these standards. And I think a lot of what our work and the work I've described is based on is the idea that companies don't want to adopt different standards for different places anymore. They want to decide what's important to them in terms of the key principles that they're going to abide by. And then when you've decided that, and you decide that these principles are going to apply between Sweden and Congo, you get into some really interesting conversations about why it's more difficult to do things that way in certain parts of the world than in others. And for us, that's the most, those are the most helpful conversations to have, rather than the very kind of lazy way of doing it, which, it sounds like you're saying this was done in the past, where you would say, okay, in terms of that country, we have to do things a little bit differently because that's the way things are done there.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
So I'm going to move on to some more of the questions that I have for you, and I'm being very greedy and asking lots of questions here, but please do send in your questions. I can see some coming through already. Keep sending in your questions. We're going to keep looking at those, and we'll select some of the best ones to discuss together towards the end. So keep sending your questions. I'm just thinking about your role, because we've talked a lot about risk so far. We've talked a lot about inherent risk and the fact that there's some places where this is more difficult than others, and companies are increasingly aware of that. I want to talk a bit more about residual risk and what companies can do once they know what the challenges are to reduce the risks that they face. And because I understand it's something that you're involved with as well, and so I'd like to ask you quite generally, what are you doing to help companies mitigate their risks in this area?
Well, there are two, at least from the companies we've been working with, there are two ways I've seen companies deal with this. The first one is kind of transferring the risk, and let me give you an example of that. So let's take, for example, an engineering company or a pharmaceutical company, and they're dealing with government officials, and they expect to get equipment, materials through customs. And therefore, in their negotiation with the clients, they now have a tendency to push, and I'm not saying it's feasible in all contracts. I'm saying that in certain situations when it's critical, I'll take, for example, the pandemic and the fact of selling masks and all the PPE products. And given the urgency of that, there are a lot of clients that have asked basically the government to take on certain responsibilities so that they don't have to deal with it, and basically transferring the whole risk of having to interact with government official when it comes to customs clearance. Same thing for getting a permit to operate. They would contractually include in the agreement that's something that the client would need to get. And of course, we're talking about governmental clients. If you're doing work with corporate clients, it's more challenging. And but this is not necessarily the topic of today's session. But if we keep to government, I'm seeing more and more companies that are doing this. So that's one way of kind of not mitigating, but actually transferring the risk and it becoming more limited or inexistent. The other thing where we're helping a lot of clients is when it comes to those intermediaries, those agents, sponsors, BD consultants. So, if that, I would say, lobbyist or consultant or agent was in North America, a lot of the information is publicly available, databases, Google research, etc., and that's something that can be done. And as part of your checks, your internal checks, it could be satisfactory because you would have enough information. But when it comes to the Middle East, and that's how we're helping a lot of companies in doing enhanced reputational due diligence on those intermediaries. And basically in the Middle East, public records are quite limited. I mean, it's getting a lot better than maybe 5-10 years ago, but it's still a lot of the information is not publicly available, and therefore it really depends on speaking to people in the same industry, maybe former employees, speaking, and gathering that intelligence, that qualitative information that you're not going to find in Google, you're not going to find in any databases, and that's quite relevant to you deciding whether you wanted to do business with that agent. The other thing that we've been doing as well is doing site visit of that. There are a lot of issues that we've seen recently where companies have paid millions to a one-man shop that is actually based in a free zone in a shared offices, and he received 10, 15, 20 million dollars. It does not make sense. So I think by doing an enhanced due diligence, by doing site visits, sometimes they get us to even do an interview with that agent and put it in a report. There is now, like I said, a lot more work is doing before engaging with those intermediaries because of the issues that we've seen recently, and because of the impact that it could have on the reputation, but also all the penalties and fines that are applied.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of our work as well, to be honest. The on-site visits, going to see somebody, interviewing them, making sure that they've got all the right things in place. Because I mean, your example is really interesting of the one-man band who's getting millions of dollars to get a contract. I mean, in those kind of situations, that individual is massively incentivized to use some of the money in, maybe the kind of entertainment and hospitality with government officials that I talked about in my example. And have you seen any of that kind of activity when you don't have to be specific, but when you go and sniff around these public official agents in these markets, are you seeing a lot of hospitality culture?
Yeah, there is. I think there is a hospitality culture, and I think it's still the case in a lot of companies. The only now which is different is so what I'm seeing is there are some maximum spend that can be done in terms of entertainment with government officials. That before doing so, that needs to be approved by several layers and also recorded. So kind of having a register of gifts and entertainment that can be reviewed or accessed by anybody, or maybe even an external party. But it doesn't mean that people don't try. I mean, I remember in one of my client that the client was telling me that he was a chief compliance officer, and he was telling me that someone has tried to invite a government official for the Super Bowl and thought that was totally reasonable, but tickets are around $15,000-$20,000, which it is definitely not reasonable. The other thing also that I've seen is during, let's say, there is a RFP going on, there is kind of a blockage from inviting or speaking or entertaining any clients that is involved in that proposal or that RFP or part of that client. So that's also another thing beside the amount that is being reduced and managed well, and the recording of it, but also when can you entertain and whether it's frequent enough. Not frequent enough. So that there are several factors now that people, especially compliance officers or legal counsels, are looking at and providing a more stringent oversight over the business, because they want the best for the company as well, and they want to make sure that the company will not be in trouble if the business decide to entertain that client.
And I think I'm struck by what you say about the importance of recording, and I think as a business that helps companies develop good systems in this area, we're very keen on the idea of recording things. So, and it's not only good practice in terms of oversight, but it's also good practice in terms of if you ever end up before the regulatory authorities with any kind of accusation, then you can say, look, I recorded everything. I knew what systems we had in place to mitigate the risks for our use of agents in each different context. I recorded all of the gifts and hospitality that were over a certain amount, and these went through certain approval procedures. I just think recording things is such a no-brainer, but it so often gets lost, and we see so many companies in our assessments that just don't bother with it. And what I'm thinking is that a lot of my kind of on the ground experience of this is kind of pre-coronavirus, it's pre-lockdown, because I haven't traveled to do an on-site assessment since February. And so I'm wondering about the post-coronavirus world and the impact that that will have on things like records. Because what I'm seeing, and we've touched on this a little bit, what I'm seeing is that more and more companies are doing things digitally now. So, you know, every conversation we've had in preparation for this webinar has been totally digital. Most of the conversations we've had internally about this webinar have been digital, and we're moving away from that kind of culture where, you know, somebody puts a piece of paper on your desk and says, can you sign that please, and then, you know, you never see it again. And I wonder if you think on the specific issue of recording these things that coming out of coronavirus will be in a better position.
I think you know, I think it's more I would say it goes back to people wanting to kind of record rather than that's my view, whether it's online or paper. I always had the feeling that having a paper or giving a paper to someone to sign, it's usually sometimes that paper can get lost or forgotten somewhere or not archived, for instance. Where now I think with online, if there is a follow-up after you know, after that discussions or getting an online approval just by email, it doesn't have to have an approval workflow and so on. I think that one, it will make it easier. And also, you know, I'll give you an example. If you need that paper to be signed and it needs to be signed by the legal counsel, the compliance officer, and he's difficult to find because he's traveling or busy, you know, it's making it easier now when things are done by email, where they can just send that, you know, that approval form and get it approved by email. So I think I'm hoping at least that post-COVID will make it easier from a recording standpoint. And you know, sometimes we're human, we're a bit lazy, and therefore we just you know, maybe by now making things online, it will make it easier for us to document things.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and I think we're going to move on in a few minutes to the audience Q&A, because there's more interesting questions coming through now. But before we do that, I mean, one more question for you. We've talked a lot about the kind of the negative aspects here and the examples of really bad practice and when things go wrong and all the scandals, etc. Do you have any examples of companies who are really getting this right? Have you ever dealt with a client or any other kind of company in your experience and you thought, wow, everybody should be doing what they're doing?
Well, yeah, I think I have a few, but I think the most illustrative one that I'd like to share, I think it's really, I felt that when I heard the story, it was quite creative. So basically, you know, in certain countries, and I'll take for Africa, for instance, when you are trying to exit the country, you're going through customs, and then, you know, they ask you for $50, $100 so that they can stamp exit and let you out. So, and this company, it's a US international company, they decided to, of course, not to pay that fee anymore. And they had the idea to ask all the employees, because they were working on project in that country, and there were a lot of travels happening, a lot of employees going back and in and out of the country. And basically they asked the employees to start wearing company t-shirt or a sweatshirt or with the logo on it and the color and everything. And basically when the first employee came to the borders, he was asked the same thing, and he said, no, I'm not given, this is a company policy, can I see your supervisor, etc. And of course they hold him, they had to return him back. He came back the next day, same thing, and then they allowed him in. And after that, the second employee, they did the same thing, but to a lesser extent. And then the third and fourth employees. At a certain point, basically all custom officials in that airport stopped asking those employees for anything, because they've seen them, because of the logo, because of the color of the t-shirt they were wearing. They were saying, well, these people basically are not going to pay us, so there's no point in wasting our time trying to ask them. And I found it didn't take much, quite creative, did work. Maybe the first people did suffer a bit more than the latter, but I thought it was a good story, and a good way of reducing that type of behavior.
I really like that. I mean, I've never heard of that kind of thing before, but I think it gives not only the people who might request a bribe the really clear message that they're not going to get it, but it also gives the people within that company a good sense of team, right? A sense of we, the team, are refusing this kind of behavior. And that's what really works in our experience, is when the communications they're getting are about, we as a company are deciding to do this in a certain way, and it's not about individuals, it's about, as we talked about before, it's about the standards we're setting for ourselves. I think that's really, really good case study.
I just told the client, just give me a t-shirt so that next time I'm in that country, at least I have that on me and I can wear it to the customs. But that I haven't tried that yet, but I don't know if it's gonna work.
Nice?
Still.
Is it a cool t-shirt? Is it a cool color?
It's all right. Yeah, it can be worn in an airport.
Good. All right, that's good enough. I mean, I'm going to move on now to some of the questions we're getting from the audience, because
Sure.
I think they're going to be some of the most interesting ones. Here's one asking you about any implementation locally of a new cabinet resolution requiring companies to keep records of, and perhaps even disclose, their beneficial ownership to the authorities. The person asking this question, I'm not going to name them, but they're interested in this from the point of view of due diligence efforts, for example, especially when you've got companies that are quite complex in structure, and perhaps even include things like shell companies. Are you coming across a lot of that in your work?
Yeah, so I think we've been able, especially here in the region or in the UAE, to be able to find basically the beneficial owners of companies. It is still difficult in certain free zones, to be honest with you. But to the point of the question, I think there are some changes happening where they want to keep. They want to provide that information and allowing people. So that's a recent change, I would say. So I haven't seen the local implementation of it by some of the free zones, but I think that would facilitate a whole lot our work. But also, I don't know to what extent they will make it public to anybody who would ask for it. But that, I think it goes in the same direction that we've been talking about earlier, in terms of a lot of positive changes are happening, and it's toward being more transparent and allowing for more transparencies. And I think people are tired to say that we can we have a company located in one of the free zones, and we don't know who owns it ultimately, because it's a, I won't say a shell company, but it's a company that those records cannot be shared with the ultimate requester. So in short, no, I haven't seen a local implementation yet, but I know from what I'm hearing in the market, it's in the works, and I think it will just make it easier for everybody to get that information going forward.
Yeah, and I agree with you that the issue of transparency is key. It's certainly something that I think we've seen over the course of our history doing this, that it used to be, as you say, you get large complex businesses who they're aware that they're doing certain things in certain different parts of the world, but they don't have much more detail than that. But with the way that businesses are so much more interconnected now, and the way that the world is so much more of a small place now, companies have a lot more kind of visibility of the kind of risks that they're exposed to. And because they have that kind of visibility, they're figuring out the kind of questions I talked about earlier about why certain standards are harder to achieve in certain environments. And yeah, it's been something that's kept us busy for a long time. I'm going to keep going through these questions from the audience, and do keep sending them through, guys, because it's one of the most interesting things is when we get your perspectives on this and when we're able to respond to specific points that you raise. So again, I'm not going to name this person, but this person is very proud of themselves because they've come up with a controversial question. And in these sessions, remember, we really like controversial questions, so keep them coming. It says, controversial questions. How on earth are we going to reconcile this definition in the UAE of a public official, which is something we talked about earlier, and make sure that our policies can fit with this when so many people in this area, this part of the world, are public officials, or they're ex-public officials, or they're related to a public official, or they're an employee of a government-owned or a semi-government-owned company. I think the question is about, are we making setting traps for ourselves when we talk about controls in this area, when there are parts of the world where almost everybody is a government official? Do you have any thoughts on that, Amin?
Well, look, I can see the point and I can see the challenge that the population of the public officials, or what would be seen as a public official, is greater here than, let's say, in the US or elsewhere in the world. But I think it doesn't make it, it makes it challenging for us compliance officer, legal counsel to deal with that, and especially also from a business standpoint to deal with that, because you need to comply. But I think there is also an understanding from international law enforcement, DOJ and SEC, that this is a culture. I mean, it's not, they know that, and I think, again, it goes back to, you know, documenting your thought process, what you've done, doing a proper due diligence, you know, and putting in place certain mitigating factors when dealing with that public officials. So I hear the challenge. I don't think it's impossible, but it makes, and to be honest with you, for us as compliance officers or legal counsel, it's good to have a bigger population, but because it means that we are needed in the sector and within the company. So you should see it on that front as well. But reconciling that definition would be to the Western world would be quite difficult, quasi impossible, to be honest with you. So I think it's better to have a bigger population and try to go through it and you know, decide which one is really a public official, someone, basically it's not only a public official, but someone who has a decision-making process in you know, awarding you for that project, for instance, is an important factor as well. So again, if you're able to document it, do a proper due diligence, sometimes get advice from counsel when it's very sensitive, when it's complex, and then, you know, if I know some of the clients that came to us, and because the DOJ started knocking on their doors, and we've seen cases where the DOJ reviewed what they've done and they were comfortable, and at least they took it as part of the leniency program, or to lower their fines or so what, not for that specific, but I'm talking in general. So that's my view on that. Not necessarily controversial question, but yeah, I think that would be my view.
There you go. So we view that question as not that controversial. It's an interesting response, but I think it's an interesting question, isn't it? And I think you can pick apart certain parts of this question, because you know, a lot of the issues that are raised here sound to me like they fit neatly into the conflict of interest box, right? I mean, the person asking the question talks about ex-public officials. In some of the assessment work we've done, we've seen lots of ex-public officials, because they're part of economies where, you know, there are a lot of public officials around. Everybody works for the government, and sometimes what happens is you get somebody who used to be a public official in a decision-making capacity, who then retires from that job or resigns from that job, and then immediately gets a job as some kind of government affairs advisor or political liaisons consultant or lobbyist with a big private sector company wanting to do business in that area. And it makes total sense to them. You know, I can make a lot of money by getting hired by a company to basically talk to all my old colleagues about the fact that they should work with these guys. But on the part of the company, which is where we would come in as GoodCorporation, would be to say, look, it's up to you to make sure you're doing, first of all, your due diligence on these guys. If you're about to bid for a major public contract in Egypt, make sure you're not, about to recruit the former petroleum minister to be your advisor, or to be your consultant in this area. And secondly, if you're recruiting anybody from that kind of background, you need to make sure that you can show that you've recognized that. So document your conflicts of interest where they occur. Document your politically exposed people where you choose to work with them. And then if you end up before the authorities, like in the example you gave, you'll be able to show these people, yeah, okay, we had systems in place to identify the risks. When we identified the risk, we did this and this to mitigate the risks. And so, we, in an environment where this is very difficult to get right, we did everything we possibly could to make sure that we did.
Well, I think when you were mentioning conflict of interest, I thought you were going in a different way. But to that, just to add to your point, is and related to the question, conflict of interest, family members. The definition of family here in the region is totally different from the definition of family in the Western world. So, in terms of, well, do you see it as a conflict if it's the cousin of an individual? So, it's another layer. We're talking about a lot of public officials, their status and so on, everybody is, and there is another layer to it in terms of families and a conflict of interest. But again, policies need to be adjusted in that case to account for additional layers in the family, because it's not the same. So I thought you were going in that route, but yeah, just to add on what you just said.
Yeah, no, I'm going more down the route of hiring former government people. But your point about family is so interesting, because it kind of takes us into an area where you're very experienced, which is the local issues of local culture. And we've just had another question come in from the audience about that. And again, this perhaps touches on the controversial side, but maybe we won't think that it is. But they're asking about what aspects of this are more difficult to control in the region we're talking about now. So if we're looking at the Gulf, if we're looking at the MENA region, we already talked about family, but what are the other little customary things in this region that makes interacting with government officials harder than doing it in Sweden or Belgium?
So I think we beside the family, I think the hospitality and culture. So in some of the instances, some of the meetings happens what we call in mejlis. So we drinking coffee, tea with some dates. In a lot of the countries in the region, to be honest with you, and therefore that people should not see it as something that they cannot do when they're kind of entertaining the client necessarily, but it's something that is customary, and I've seen a lot of international companies doing it, and it's accepted by their headquarters. So I don't see any issue to that, but that's something that could happen. You'll see also here the culture that and maybe it's the case elsewhere, but clients will refer to you their family members, friends for jobs, for internships, and I think the way I've seen clients handling that is explaining like that the process is managed, either centrally or regionally, that it needs to follow the process, and they're more than happy to send the CV, and that CV would go through the proper channels and go through the proper process. So you'll get requests for sure of that nature when interacting with the public officials. But those are just few examples that I've noticed in the region, to be honest with you, and that I can think of right now as well.
And I think it's the same in our experience, and we often work with companies in that part of the world, and they're subject to a lot of the same things about, can you give my son a job, can you give my cousin a job, etc. And we're often advising people to say that, when it comes to conflicts of interest, a potential conflict of interest isn't a bad thing in itself. You just need to make sure that you've put all the controls in place and records in place to show that every decision has been made in a totally objective way. So it comes back to what you were saying about how, yeah, if somebody wants you to hire their son, then you tell them, yeah, they're very welcome to apply as part of the usual channels. And then as part of the usual channels, you would put in place systems to make sure that no family member of theirs is involved in the decision-making process in an isolated way, to make sure that all these things are part of the machinery of compliance that we've been talking about. And I think all these sessions have been giving the little parts in that machinery of compliance, and this one on regulatory affairs and government interaction has been one of the most, you know, maybe controversial, maybe not, but certainly one of the most high-risk areas that we've looked at. And I think we've covered a lot of ground really well. I think it only really remains for me to wrap this up now. I mean, I'm going to start by thanking everybody for coming. That's some really interesting questions that came through from the audience there. I hope we've answered them in a satisfactory way. I think the discussion, I mean, has been absolutely fascinating, and you've brought things in terms of added value that we're extremely welcome. So thank you for that. Your experience in this subject in this region is very interesting for the listeners, I think. And other than that, it just remains for me to say we're going to be carrying on with these sessions. So next week we'll be doing the sales and marketing function, which, and every time I do one of these, I think, oh, today we're dealing with the most high risk area, but then I think, no, there's something else that's even more high risk. So we're going to be talking about sales and marketing. We're going to be talking about how we can control our interactions in that area. And if you thought this was a difficult one, then just tune in next week and we'll see what happens. So other than that, I hope to see everybody next week. We're going to be sending around the slides, and yeah, finally, huge thank you to you, Amin. Thanks to everyone else for coming, and
thank you.
Yeah, I hope our paths cross again soon.
Will do.
Okay.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.